Hi, this is another iOS tutorial, and today we will be going over XML, SOAP, and web services. A web service is a method of communication between two electronic devices over a network. It is a software function provided at a network address over the web, with the service always on, as in the concept of utility computing. In other words, web services are like a function that you would call over a network. Like you would normally call a function in code, but this function is called over a network, and the actual code for it is stored on a server and not on your local device. Note that not only is the code stored on a server, but also all computing resources, including databases and processors, are also stored on the server. Because both the client and the server use different resources and different languages, we need a method of formatting the data such that both the client and the server can communicate and interpret data they pass between each other. In that case, or in this case, well, we're going to be using XML. Uh, XML stands for Extensible Markup Language, and it's essentially a format such that to describe data, such that the data can be read across different platforms. XML is mainly composed of elements. An element is everything from the start tag to the end tag. So as you can see on the screen, there are a bunch of purple words surrounded by carets, and those words are called tags. The purple words are tags. The start tag is just the name of the tag surrounded by the two less than and greater than sign. And then the end tag is the same manner, except there's a backslash in front of the name of the tag. So everything encapsulated in that tag is the element. Elements can be nested in terms of other elements, and that's generally how XML works. Two other key parts of an XML file are a prologue and the namespaces. The prologue is just the first line. What it specifies is a version and an encoding. The encoding has to do with how the characters are translated into bits and bytes. And the most common coding is UTF-8. There's also UTF-16, and I think there's a couple others. The other thing you have to note here is the namespaces. As you can see on my screen, the namespaces are specified in blue. What a namespace does is everything under the namespace must have a unique name, but you can have two elements with the same name if they are under different namespaces. So it's a bit like scope in Objective-C or C++ or anything you've coded. There's also a default namespace, so that's sort of the same way of doing the same thing as the blue, except the syntax is a little different. So when you say XML NS equals whatever, that's your namespace for everything that's under that element. So with the blue, you see here we have to write the name of our namespace, which is SOAP12 : and then the name of our element. With the yellow, we just have to declare it at the top, and then it would, if there were any elements in the beer list in this case, they would all be under that namespace. SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. SOAP is a protocol for transferring information over a network. So the reason why we went over XML was because SOAP uses XML to pass the data. SOAP is the protocol for communicating with a web service, or one of two possible protocols. One is SOAP, one is REST. Those are the two main protocols. And SOAP is probably the one with the most overhead. SOAP uses XML style requests in order to send and receive data. In order to send the SOAP requests, what we will be using is the HTTP protocol. And the HTTP protocol has 4 fields in this case. The method field contains the method we will use for the request. I think there's 8 or so methods, but the most common are get and post. Get means get data from a server, and post means send the data. So from our Xcode, from our Objective-C, we're going to be using the post method. Body contains the actual data. In this case, it's going to be the XML encoding of our data. Content type specifies what kind of content is in this protocol, in this HTTP request. and in our case it'll be application SOAP.xml, and we also have to specify the character encoding. So UTF-8 is the most common, so we'll be using that. And then the content length is merely the number of bytes in the body of the request. So I'll show you how to do all that in Objective-C. So in Objective-C, what we will be doing is using the class NSMutableURLRequest. So this is sort of like an envelope that we're going to send to the web service. So what we do is we first declare it with the URL, with our URL or web service. Then, as you can see there, set HTTP method, set HTTP body. That's exactly what we discussed in the previous slide. So from there, all we got to do is send the request. To send the request, first we need to make a container for the data we receive back. So we do that. That's our response data. And then we use NSURL connection. So here I'm sending a synchronous request. Usually you'll probably send an asynchronous request because you don't want to block the UI while you're waiting for the results. But here we're just going to send a synchronous request, and we're going to just not check for errors. It's a very basic request. And then when we get that data back, what we're going to do is we're going to take make a string response text, and we're going to generate it from that data, knowing that the data is UTF-8 encoded. So after we unencode the data, what we have is the basic XML. So all we have to do now is parse it. So parsing is basically reading the data and deriving meaning from the data. For instance, you might parse a sentence by identifying the nouns and the verbs, and that allows you to derive meaning from the sentence. So the way it works is we set our class to be the delegate of the NSXML parser, and just have the delegate parse the data, and it will. If we implement the correct protocols, we'll be able to parse the data to check the response, and we'll be able to complete the web service call. So we're going to start a new project here, just to illustrate what we just went through. So I'm just going to call it SOAP and XML example. Click Save or Next. Okay, so there's our project. First, we're just going to make a couple changes to the view. This is all stuff from earlier chapters, so you should understand it by now, hopefully. We're going to resize it so it's the size of our phone, and we're going to go ahead and add a couple labels. So there we go. And from there, I'm going to drag some text fields out onto the view. So this app will be like a user login app, and the idea is the login itself is going to be a web service, and the web service is what's going to access the database to tell us whether the username and password are valid. So we're going to go ahead and add a submit button as well here, I think, and then we're going to attach the outlets and the actions that we need in order to. First, we need to access what's in those text fields, and then we also need to have the submit button send an action to our code. So it shows up like we want it to show up. Good. So there we go. So most of the bulk of the work is going to be done in login here. Before we get into login though, I just want to show you something that's kind of useful. If you go to the URL of your web service on the internet, uh, for me at least, it shows you a template of what the request is going to look like, the SOAP request, which is we did go over in the PowerPoint already. But in case you wanted some help, I thought this would be useful for people for your particular one if you're not sure what to do. So next what we're going to do is we're going to build up the envelope that was in the template, or if you refer back to the PowerPoint, it's basically the body of the request. So first thing we do is we're going to put in the prologue, and we're just going to have the first line of that request here. So we're just building up this string envelope text. Next, what we do is the basically passing of parameters. If you remember, I said web services are a bit like a function that you call over a network. And functions take arguments. So this is kind of where the magic happens here. So we're going to put the username we got from our text field and our password we got from our text field into this body of the envelope. And then later the web service will take those and it will be able to compare it against a database and say whether this is a valid username password pair. Then finally we just close the brackets, and I am going to have the whole thing print out in NSLog so we can see what the envelope looks like when we're done. So we'll just run it and let's see what happens. Okay, so we're running it here. So we're just going to input a username and a password. So the idea is I want to make sure these show up correctly in the envelope when we print it out to NSLog. So if they show up correctly and everything's tagged correctly, then we're ready to send it. So there you go. Spacing doesn't matter. Just first tag and then tag ending it have to match up, and they did there. So it looks like we're good. So it's time to just make our request. Now the first thing we need is the URL of the web service. So I'm just going to type my particular URL in here. We're going to copy it, paste it from somewhere else. And then after that, we just have to use the mutable URL request that we talked about in the slideshow. So we just have to, it's like sort of like an envelope, like you put stuff in the envelope and then you send it to the post office. The request object is going to contain everything that we need to send to the web service. So it's going to have the method, which is post. It's going to have the body, which is that string, that envelope we just created. And then it's going to need the content length and the content type. Content type is, there's a special for SOAP. It's like, we'll type it in soon, but you'll see what it is. And then for the length, we just have to get the number of bytes from the envelope. So we can do that with a method of NSData, which we will. We're going to have to convert that envelope text to an envelope, and then we will a data envelope, an envelope of type NSData. And then from there, we just can use the length instance method to return the number of bytes, which is convenient. So, yep. So body is envelope. That's a mistake. We'll have to fix that later. It's going to have to be of type NSData, I think. So see, it's throwing a warning there. That's because we have a slight typing issue there, but I'll fix it later. You'll see. And then we have to set value for HTTP header fields. So the content length and the content type are header fields here. So I'm just going to kind of set the fields themselves here, type them in. So content type, and then the next one's content length, and then I think I'm just gonna paste in the actual values for these fields. So let's see what happens here. there we go. So application SOAP XML character set UTF-8 is the content type. So that's the encoding and the MIME type. And then the down here, this is where I kind of made a mistake. So we can't use the envelope here because there's no envelope. I need an, oh wait, no, I do have an envelope. There it is. So you notice we added a line up there. It says envelope text data using UTF encoding, so UTF-8. So with that data, then we can get the length, and then we can substitute it into our NS string with format. So that allows us to pass the number of bytes to the web service. So there you go. A little bit complicated, but not really when you think about it, when you really look at it. And then, so that's all good. Now what we need to do is we have to use the NSURL connection to send the data, I think. So I think we're going to make another NSData object here, response data, and then we're going to use the NSURL connection, I believe. We're just going to make it synchronous for simplicity. If you make it asynchronous, you have to make sure that there's some synchronization there because it doesn't block the main thread, so you don't know where the main thread is going to be when it returns. So you have to account for that. So to make it simpler, we're going to send a synchronous request in the main thread, which is something you probably wouldn't normally do if you did this, but it will show you the concept of how this works. So that's the key thing. And so that will give us the response data. So here we're going to grab the response text. So we're just going to use the UTF-8 encoding to basically turn our data, which is bytes, into a string again. And then I think we're going to print that out. And after that, all we have to do is to parse the data. So we're going to go through a couple things here. We're going to use the XML parser object, and we're going to show you how to use the protocols of this object and how to set the delegate. So there's our response text. To start, we're going to go ahead and create the NSXML parser object. So it's sort of like you remember we made the envelope sort of for the web service, or the envelope text, and sent it to the web service. This is kind of like that. This is the object that is going to do the actual parsing. Okay. So we need to send it the response data again. So we say init with data response data. And then we say parser set delegate to ourself, because we want to do, it's just going to tell us when did an element start, when did an element end, and what is in the current element. Those are the three things it's going to tell us. So the programmer has to figure out what to do with that. And we will. So there's parser parse, and that's what starts the parsing. We're going to add one thing, an instance variable here. And this is going to let us keep track of what is in the current element. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly, I think, paste in some of these protocols because I don't necessarily remember them by heart. But so did start element, found characters, did end element. That's it. So all we're going to do in those start and end ones is just keep track of what the current element name is. So when we start the element, it's equal to current element name. When I end the element, clear that name, and then at every given stage, that between every tag, that element name should contain the correct element name. And then here, this is where the meat of the code is. So in found characters, we have first check if it's equal to is user valid result. If it's equal to 0, that means it isn't a valid result. Login failed, alert shows up. And if it's equal to 1, login succeeded shows up. Okay, so that's easy enough, I think. The logic isn't too complicated there. And now all we have to do really is just run this thing. And I think I made... I still got to fix this envelope here. So we'll fix that. It has to be data, not a string. And there we go. Envelope, response data, response text. Let's see. I think that's it. I think this is just unused variable. And so 0, nothing is in the database, so it returns true. But if I do the other thing, put in random characters, it returns false. So that tells you it works, all right? That's what's supposed to happen. So this has been another iOS tutorial.